Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's BakerRisk webinar, PSM Gap Assessments, presented by Jeff Dancy and Eric Freiberger. Now, for today's webinar, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. First, we want to respond to your questions during and following this webinar. Please type all questions into the Q&A box in the Zoom control panel, as our technical staff, Dwayne Raymer, will be responding live to all questions. At the close of our webinar today, please provide feedback by responding to our survey, where you can provide recommendations for today's presentation and future webinar topics. We're excited to have Wayne, Jeff, Eric, Dwayne, and Amber present today. So without further ado, I will turn the time over to Wayne Repick, who is the Global Director of Business Development and Marketing and Communications, and the Key Account Program Director for BakerRisk, to make a few remarks. Wayne?
Thank you, Naomi, and welcome to everybody in Egypt and throughout the world. Good afternoon. This is so good to be here once again, every 4 months. Always good to be presenting for you. We've got a great session planned, PSM Gap Assessments. We've had a lot of feedback about this and have a lot of people signed up attending this. So we're very excited for your enthusiasm. Thank you for that. This was a topic that came about from your suggestions. So we're pleased to be able to present this to you. Jeff and Eric are certainly experts in this area. I think you'll agree after this session, you'll see that. And then, as always, in the background, we have one of our senior SMEs answering questions, Dwayne Raymeyer. So please do not hesitate, as you have questions throughout the chat, to bombard him and just fill up the chat box with a lot of questions. He is keen to answer them all. I want to thank our continuous support that we have from the ministry, Minister Kareem Badawi, for his continued support of everything that we've been doing and working with him. Engineer Ala El-Batal, Engineer Motaz Atif. They've been very supportive of all of our activities, and it's very nice to be working with them continually. And of course, Shema Sama for her support, and Mohammed Sabri. Always good, and we appreciate the assistance in distributing our flyer and getting our information out to all of you. I know that Egypt had a few internet issues recently, but it didn't seem to dampen the ability for people to register, so thank you for that. You know, when we started this, it was about 2 years ago this month that we started designing our first webinar back in 2023. And we had no idea of the success of this, of the reception. Here we are 6 webinars later, and it looks to still be going strong. So we will be doing the 7th one in December. And as always, we'd like to get topics that you're interested in. So please, during the chat today, emails, whatever it is, send us what it is that you're interested in having us present on. And that's how we decide what we're going to do. The only one we chose was the first one. And after that, we've always responded to what each of you have wanted, and you've sent us topics on. So please continue to do that. It's been a very strong, successful couple of years, and we hope to continue it. We'll keep doing it as long as you want. So what we're going to do today is immediately after the session, or sometime later today, you will get this deck sent out to you. Everybody who's registered will get a copy of the deck that you're going to see. So you'll have that as a reference for you. So that'll go out today. Within 1 week, we are going to also send out a video recording of this webinar. So you'll have that for your reference. And then within 2 weeks, we will take all the questions that you've sent in prior to the webinar, all the questions sent in during the chat. And even though you've gotten some answers to those, we're going to go back through them, and we're going to complete them, elaborate on them a little bit more fully. And we will send you a full transcript of all the questions asked leading up and during the webinar. So that will go out within 2 weeks, and that's the way we normally do it every single time. So if you have questions, again, please feel free to ask now. You can even send them in via email in the next day or two, and we'll add those to the list. But you will get all the questions and answers back to you. And any other resources, any white papers, anything else referenced, you'll get a copy of that as well. And lastly, I just want to congratulate our friends at Athedco for their Scope 3 certification. I'm blown away that you guys did this. It's very, very impressive. It's just, I wouldn't have expected that. So I am very keen and very interested in learning about how you went about that. I will be reaching out to some of you to find that out, but I want to congratulate all of our good friends at Edco for that achievement. Just simply wonderful. So with that, I will turn this over to Jeff Dancy, who is going to lead off and start off with our PSM Gap Assessments webinar. Thank you, everybody. Jeff?
All right. Thank you, Wayne. As Wayne said, I'll be leading off with the gap assessment webinar. First off, just a little bit on my background. I've been working in industry for around 30 years or so. I worked in chemical, oil and gas, petrochemical industries, and I've been with BakerRisk for about 9 years. And a large portion of my job is that I lead the PSM assessment and audit group. I'm going to pass off to Eric to introduce himself now.
Good afternoon. I'm Eric Freiberger. I have over 35 years of professional experience, ranging from consulting engineering up to executive leadership roles. I've participated in the processing industries in all areas, and I have a fellow in the American Institute of Chemical Engineers and a fellow for the Center for Chemical Process Safety. I'm a professional licensed civil engineer in multiple jurisdictions, and I will turn it over to Wayne.
Actually, it'd be Dwayne.
Dwayne, I'm sorry.
Good morning. I'm Dwayne Raymeyer, and I've been with BakerRisk for almost 19 years. I have over 45 years industry experience in process safety and fire protection. Thanks for joining the webinar this morning.
All right. Just briefly, this is our BakerRisk sort of quick summary for the company for those of you who may not be familiar. We do engineering, research, risk assessment associated with process safety, and we have specialties in a lot of different areas associated with that, including obviously auditing for process safety management and risk-based process safety, explosion and chemical testing, and a bunch of other areas. So today we're going to look at an introduction to auditing. I'll talk about how to prepare for assessments, how you conduct yourself during a PSM assessment or audit, and then I will turn it over to Eric to discuss development of findings and reporting of audits. And really the focus today is we want to discuss practical ways to organize and conduct an assessment or audit at a site. And we'll be trying to discuss things that will help you meet the MO, PMR, PSM guidelines. So, introduction to auditing. First of all, there's several different reasons you might want to conduct an assessment or an audit at your site. In some areas, there's going to be regulatory requirements. Obviously, US has their OSHA requirement. UK has a COMA requirement. You may have a corporate standard that says you have to do audits or assessments on specific things on a regular basis. There's also external accreditation. If you're certified for ISO, then you need to do ISO accreditation audits on a regular basis. And there's obviously just performance assurance, and this could be driven by the company you work for. It could be driven by your local environment. So you have your MOPMR requirement in Egypt, and you could have specific company procedures or requirements that talk about assuring performance in different areas. You can conduct audits and assessments in a lot of different areas. Obviously, financial audits are probably the most common worldwide. Health and safety audits, environmental audits are common. Obviously, today we're going to talk specifically towards process safety management, but the actual structure, the framework, the principles behind it are the same from one area to the next. But one of the key things is any auditor or assessor that you send to a site has to understand what they're auditing to, and they have to be competent in the area that they're auditing. They need to understand it well enough so that when they're asking questions about it, they're not going to be confused or misled or misunderstand the answers. So typically there are three major types of assessment that are done. Regulatory or compliance auditing is done to a specific regulation or compliance or accreditation standard. This is where you have your OSHA audits, you have your ISO accreditation audits. The protocol for these things is limited specifically to what's covered under that regulation or accreditation. And when you do a finding for this type of assessment, it's going to call out specifically what part of that regulation or protocol you're going against that you've deviated from. Usually when you do this type of audit, it's going to be fairly large. For say a small to mid-sized chemical company, you might have 5 assessors there for a week and a half. So it's going to be multiple different people on site for multiple days to cover this type of thing. Risk-based auditing is a slightly larger scope. So this is things like the CCPS, risk-based process safety protocol, or the Institute of Engineering PSM protocol. These are larger risk-based protocols. They don't necessarily align strictly with just what's in a compliance audit. They'll go beyond basic compliance. They'll talk about good practices and best practices and adhering to recommended practices and published codes and standards. Typically, when you have this type of protocol, they're going to focus on areas of highest risk, and your audit team and size varies quite a bit depending on how broad the scope is defined when you set it up. And finally, you have performance assurance audits. These are usually done to a single element, a single process, a single procedure. This is something like a facility that has a management of change audit that they do on a quarterly basis or something like that. So it's typically a limited scope, usually only maybe 1 or 2 auditors, and it's based on compliance, usually to a corporate practice or system. So now we'll talk about preparation and planning. When you actually go to develop an audit, what are the steps that you need to go through? So overall, there's basically 6 general things that you're going to look for when you start developing an assessment. You need to establish the scope of your assessment so you can determine how many people you need need for the support, what the location is, what type of assessment you're doing. When you've got a scope, you need to either confirm your protocol, or if it's going to be the first time you're doing this, you need to develop an audit protocol to ensure you're covering everything that's in scope for that audit. You need to look at the duration of the audit, who's on the assessment team, develop a schedule for both the site and the auditors, and provide a list of documents to the site of what's being reviewed. So first, when you're determining scope, obviously you're going to look at the size of the facility you're going to. So you want to know approximately how many employees do they have, how many units do they have, or processes do they have, what the location is, and what type of audit are you doing. If it's a compliance audit to a regulation or a standard or some type of certification, if it's a risk-based audit, which has a bit broader scope, or if you're talking about a subject-specific audit, so looking at one single process, single hazard, single project, whatever. A combination of both the size of the facility and the complexity of the protocol will tell you how many auditors you need and how long they need to be there. When you're developing the protocol, it's going to be based on the type of assessment you're doing. So if you are doing a protocol based on a specific regulation, it's going to call out all the facets of that regulation that need to be complied to. You may already have protocols if it's a assessment that's done on a periodic basis, like once every 3 years or 5 years or something like that. Or you might need to develop a protocol in advance of the assessment. If you do need to develop a new protocol, part of your schedule is you need to give yourself time to develop it. And that can take several weeks, depending on how complex the audit subject is. When you're talking about compliance audits, you have to include every requirement of whatever regulation or standard you're assessing against. You have to make sure company procedures meet those requirements. You typically have to verify compliance to those standards in the field. And a lot of regulations or standards require compliance with written company procedures. So if I talk about doing an audit to a specific PSM regulation, there is usually some part of that regulation that states not only do company procedures need to cover what's in the regulation, but the company needs to comply with its own procedures. And then when you talk about risk-based or recognized, generally accepted good engineering practice type of assessments, you're usually going to have the full regulatory compliance protocol for whatever area you're assessing. Plus, you're going to talk about best practices, published recommended practices, and assess against those beyond what's just in compliance regulation. And as a caution, if you do have a pre-existing protocol for a certain type of audit that you're going to be doing, you need to review and verify that every once in a while to make sure it's staying current with whatever standards or regulations it covers. All right, so for compliance audits specifically, they're usually covering a specific regulation like the OSHA, PSM, EPA, RMP, the offshore BSEE SEM standard, ISO accreditation, responsible care accreditation. There is generally a specific regulation or a certification you're trying to meet. So you have to make sure that your protocol is based on that regulation or that standard. It has to have specific clauses, sentence, paragraphs of that regulation listed in your protocol. And anytime there is a finding in that type of audit, it should be linked to a specific clause of the regulation. Part of the requirements for a compliance audit, you may have a requirement for auditor certification. So if you do ISO certification audits, any auditor for that type of thing has to be accredited with ISO to do their certification audits. As I noted, your findings have to be linked directly to clauses in the regulations, and the regulation may require specific reporting formats. In terms of risk assessment protocols, risk-based assessments are covered against some type of framework which is published. One of the more common ones is the CCPS RBPS requirements. That stands for risk-based process safety. It's a guideline and a framework that will help you focus to specific types of risks and address specific hazards. You have the MOPMR guidelines, and the European Energy Institute PSM performance is another type of risk-based assessment. Protocols are based on qualitative requirements beyond strict prescriptive performance requirements. So you're looking for good practices and best practices. You at a minimum have to meet local regulations, but you typically want to see behavior that's better than that. And when you're doing a risk-based assessment, you can make recommendations for things that are better than just compliance. So as I noted, the CCPS RBPS is a example of a typical non-regulatory style assessment. There's a framework that's published by the CCPS. They have a guidebook for it. It basically follows management principles of the Plan, Do, Check, Act. Part of the RBPS is it's focused on areas of highest risk. So you focus your audit to spend more time on elements that are a higher risk. The protocol in the RBPS can be used and broken down into specific subsets of audits, like you can do specifically a mechanical integrity risk-based assessment and not cover the entire subject matter. The typical expectation when you're doing that type of risk-based assessment is you're going beyond strict regulatory compliance. You want good policies and good behaviors. Other audits will be conducted on agreed upon scope of work. So you can do audits on almost anything. You just have to agree on what's the protocol you're doing, what's the subject matter you're auditing. So you can do compliance auditing to a specific standard. You can do health and safety and environmental reviews. You can do benchmarking reviews where you're auditing and comparing one site against another in different areas. You could do specifically culture reviews where you're looking at site leadership, site behaviors, not necessarily regulatory framework, but overall attitudes at the site. So there's a lot of different subsets of limited scope audits you can look at. Regardless of what type of audit you're doing, you need to develop a protocol, and that has to cover all aspects of whatever regulations, codes, standards are being looked at. For larger audits, your protocol could be dozens of pages long, cover hundreds of questions, be linked to multiple different subsets of regulation or corporate standards. It can be a very long document. It can take a long time to go through. If you have one of those longer types of assessments, you're going to typically have multiple auditors, and you're going to divide that protocol up into different subsections so that different auditors can cover different areas. Each assessor will be assigned a specific section of the protocol to cover. They're going to talk to subject matter areas in that specific area of the protocol, and they are usually expected to be somebody who is more familiar with that element. There's going to be some overlap from element to element. If I do an audit where one auditor is covering management of change and another auditor is covering mechanical integrity, there's going to be some areas where those overlap, but the intent of dividing up is that you minimize that overlap and you create efficiency in what the auditors are looking at. So this is a high-level example. This is a portion of what an OSHA audit protocol would look like. So your protocol is basically going to be a list of questions or prompts to verify compliance to whatever standard or regulation you're assessing against. Every subsection of that regulation is going to be called out. In this example, you'll notice that there's both PSM and RMP references called out because those are often done conjoined in the US. You want to be able to record the auditor's name. You're going to record findings and observations, where you found them. And you also will typically want to record if you've identified good practices at that company. And part of that is that if you have identified a good practice at a specific site, it's something that site should highlight and communicate to other sites within the same company to improve performance overall of the company. So in terms of assessing to the protocol, it's expected that the minimum performance of any assessor or auditor is that all parts of the protocol will be covered or reviewed in some way. You don't want to have gaps that weren't addressed during the audit. You're going to leverage the answers you get to the specific protocol question prompts to identify where you might have non-compliance at the site, or identify issues where sites employ practices and not procedures. And that's a key performance issue. You may have a site that has good practices. They are complying with the regulation in what they actually do, but they don't have any procedure or standard to back up that behavior. And although you can say that's a positive because they're complying with what they need to do, that has a risk associated with it in that whenever those employees leave the site, they may not continue those behaviors. So you want to make sure that where they do have good practices, they've also developed or are developing procedures to ensure those practices continue when the people currently do them leave. When you are looking to choose assessors for a given site assessment, you're going to look for the size required for the team, obviously. If you have a large audit that covers multiple different areas on a site, there's a large protocol, you're going to have a team of 4 or 5 or more auditors. If there is special training or certification that those auditors need to have, you need to identify that well in advance of the actual assessment to either ensure you have the proper people available or make sure that they can get the training before they go to the site. And that could be accreditation to a specific audit standard, or it could be a specific type of safety training that's required by the site. That's not something that they're just going to get when they do the orientation at the site itself. You may have specific knowledge requirements. If I have somebody doing a mechanical integrity audit, obviously I want to have an auditor with a background in that area who understands what he's looking for. And one of the key focus areas is when you are developing an auditor team, they need to be independent of the site that they are auditing. You will want to make sure that the auditors do not have a reporting line to the management of the site, because that can sway their observations, that can sway their findings. In some larger companies, they will have independent audit or assurance groups that are a corporate group that aren't attached to any of those sites. That level of independence is acceptable. But if you can't provide that type of independence, then you need to bring in third-party auditors. And at the very least, your lead auditor has to be independent of the site, independent of the area that's being audited, so that they have that ability to produce findings without being swayed by local management or local ties. All right, when conducting the audit, there are some pre-planning activities that need to be done. Typically, once you have your group of auditors, you'll hold a pre-assessment planning meeting just to discuss the facility, talk with the facility representative, collect key planning information, get logistics, where are you going, how long, the content that you're covering, that should all be confirmed ahead of time. Everybody who's on the audit team needs to have the planning information shared with them. You need to assign protocols on larger audits to different team members so that they know what they're doing ahead of time and they can get prepared. The lead auditor will develop a draft schedule and send that to the site's technical representative or audit coordinator. And that's basically going to be something where they call out which auditors cover which elements are going to be covered when, how long interviews on each element are expected to take. And part of that is this is going to be a feedback loop where you send out a list of auditors, what they want to talk about, who they want to talk to at the site, and the site will send back a modified schedule that will fit the time requirements for their individual subject matter experts, make sure there's no overlap in interviews, that sort of thing. And when you talk about larger facilities and larger audits, you'll typically want open time in the schedule for each auditor to do follow-up after interviews to do walkdowns physically of the site and do field assessments. The draft plan will get presented between the facility and the team of auditors, should be approved well in advance, so that the schedule for both the subject matter experts at sites and the schedule for the individual auditors is known in advance, and everybody knows where and when they're supposed to be. Part of the requirements for the lead auditor or lead assessor is they need to verify information on the site, how to get there, what the directions are, requirements for flights, for cars, for hotels, any requirements for personal protective equipment that need to be brought on site by the auditors, time needed in advance for any security or safety orientations at the site before the team's allowed on site. All of that stuff needs to be coordinated between the facility representative and the lead auditor. And then your facility representative who's coordinating the audit on behalf of the site needs to ensure there are enough meeting rooms or facilities for all the auditors. They need to make sure that required permits for those auditors are available, so you don't have auditors waiting for permits to take pictures in the field or to get access to different areas, and that any required training is arranged in advance so that when the auditors show up, they're not waiting half a day to get training from the security group. Before you get to site, the lead auditor or lead assessor should be sending pre-read material, requesting pre-read material. So this could include corporate management procedures, organization details. It could include things like plot plans, P&IDs, copies of emergency response manuals, work permits, a number of different things depending on what actually is within scope of the audit. And the intent is that the auditors going to site should be able to review a lot of the documents ahead of time so that they can maximize their performance at site, so that they can have questions about specific topics prepared in advance. They know what things they want to look at. They know what they want to do at site. Going to the facility itself. As I said, we're going to talk about four things with going to the facility. We're talking about sampling requirements, conducting interviews, how auditors should be conducting themselves at site, and what typical daily activities we recommend on an assessment. So when you're talking about sampling requirements, obviously for a larger facility, you can have hundreds to thousands of different documents to prove compliance to different things. If I was doing a mechanical integrity assessment and looking at design of process safety valves, well, a chemical site might have 5,000 different process safety valves with backup documentation. You're not going to review all of them, so you need to come up with some sort of sampling guideline before you get to site. And that's basically going to be, when you have a large population, how many do you want? You're going to interview employees, but you want to verify that what they say is being done is actually being done. So typically you will develop a sampling strategy. Two example ones are shown on that slide. There's a lot of other different ways you can set up your sampling strategy, but the intent is where you have a large group of documents, you need to have a rough idea of how many you need to review to adequately assess performance in that area. And when you're doing sampling, it should be representative. So if I have a facility with 20 units that I'm going to, I can't just be looking at all the documents from one unit. I want some from every unit. In addition to the document review, we will have typically subject matter interviews. So site or facility subject matter experts on each area associated with the protocol you're reviewing will be interviewed by a member of the audit team or a couple of members, depending on what the protocol is, what the level of detail it needs to be done. In advance, like I said, you'll get a schedule, you'll estimate the interview lengths that are required to cover the protocol. SMEs typically should be notified in advance, obviously, that they have an interview and what the topics are, but you do not provide them with the protocol in advance of the interview. You just provide them with a list of what the topics that are covered in that part of the protocol are. Obviously, assessors are going to take detailed notes of their interviews, and there may be follow-up interviews or follow-up document reviews after the initial interview. Any assessor covering a specific subject matter has to be familiar with the protocol being assessed and have knowledge of the topics being assessed. And if you don't cover enough in your initial interview, then you may require additional follow-up interviews after the first one. Field walkdowns. So this depends a little bit on what type of assessment you're doing, how broad the scope is, but field walkdowns and field verifications are generally required and typically fairly important to support any audit or assessment. When you're going out into the field, and assessors should obviously be escorted by somebody knowledgeable in the area or the process that you're evaluating, and that's partly so they can answer questions by the auditor when they're going out there. And group size should be limited. You don't want 6 assessors going around with one person, because each of those assessors should have a different topic of interest they're trying to identify. You want to have, at most 2 or 3 assessors for each guide. Ideally, you have a guide for every assessor when you're doing these walkdowns. The walkdowns may be just general facility assessments. So looking for issues in the field like poor maintenance, poor infrastructure maintenance, missing fireproofing, damaged fireproofing, that type of general facility condition, which can be used to support, obviously, mechanical integrity protocols or that type of protocol. But you may be conducting that walk down for a specific compliance purpose. So perhaps you're walking down with the P&IDs to verify that they're being kept up to date. Or you could be looking for safe work permitting and ensuring that the people currently working in the field have appropriate permits and are following what's in their permit. So walk down could be either general to that facility or conducted to a specific portion of your protocol. In terms of conduct of assessors when they get to site, it should be kept in mind that any auditor, any assessor is a guest at the site. You need to be considerate of the people who work at the site. You should be respectful both to the people at the site and to the other assessors on the team. And it should be kept in mind that any assessor or auditor is technically an outside consultant. You might work for the same company, but you are not somebody who is on that site, working in that site. So you should be offering options and alternatives. It's not really up to you to say, this is what you must do. You should be saying, these are the things you can do to improve your compliance. An assessor or an auditor is not going to should not be viewing themselves as the police, as a judge, as a regulator. You are not the final word on what's acceptable. You are not paid by the word. You are basically there to identify issues, highlight them from the site, and help the site improve. This is a recommended practice that we do at BakerRisk, and really from what I've seen in industry, most auditors will do. At the end of each day of the audit, typically you will want to have a daily meeting. This is usually somewhere between half an hour to at most an hour long. And in the meeting, every auditor who's leading an element will talk to 5 different things. They're going to talk about what element they reviewed, what they identified as issues during the day, if they identified any positive behaviors or good practices at the site, what they plan to do the next day, and whether they're on schedule for the overall audit or whether they need help or support in getting follow-ups cleared up. One of the key things about these type of closeout meetings at the end of the day is you want to ensure the site is getting no surprises. You want to flag emerging issues well in advance of the actual audit completion. You want to disclose everything you've seen, any concerns you might have, and you want to make sure that you're letting the site know whether you're on schedule. As I said, typically closeout meetings, they usually run about half an hour. You don't want to run any more than about an hour at most. At the end of the audit, there will be a formal closeout meeting. Usually this includes site leadership, sometimes corporate leadership, depending on the scope of the audit. It's similar in format to what you're doing in the closeout meetings every day. It should be a short, concise review of any findings or identified issues that were found during the assessment. Every major finding should be presented in the closeout meeting. There should never be a finding that's given to the site for the first time after the closeout. If you've done your job as an auditor, you should have all of your findings before you leave the site. The only time that's not true is if the site has not managed to identify documents or something that you were looking for during the audit and they follow up and provide that afterwards. And typically, the lead auditor won't present everything in the closeout meeting. They'll use their subject matter experts to speak to specific findings. And now I'm going to pass it to Eric to discuss findings, recommendations, and reporting.
Thank you, Jeff. So we're going to start with a few basic definitions, and we'll start with the definition of a finding. Next. So a finding basically is an identified issue that has supporting evidence. So it has to be factually based. It cannot be the opinion of the assessor. And a good rule of a general rule is to see if that would be also identified by another assessor and not just an opinion of an individual. It violates a regulation, a standard, or procedure requirement that is in the protocol. So it has to be within the scope of the assessment. It requires a systematic correction that cannot be fixed by the assessor before they leave the site. If it can be fixed before the assessor leaves the site, that is an indication that it may just be an outlier and not a systematic problem that would warrant a finding. It is always included in the assessment report. What an observation is similar to a recommendation. It is an identified issue with supporting evidence, once again, factually based. It may be a single nonconformance, though, not representative of a systematic issue. Sometimes it may be fixable within the time of the assessment. Most often they're identified in the field, as Jeff talked about field inspections and going out to field verify. And because it's typically not a systematic problem, it can be something that may just be something that can be very quickly fixed. So if you're assessing asset integrity management and you look at 200 PSVs, pressure safety valves, and you find one with a broken tag, that's more leaning towards an observation rather than a finding. It also may be out of scope and not part of the assessment. So if you're assessing asset integrity management and you find something in emergency response that's outside of it, that can be an observation. They're always reported in the facility closeout meetings, but not typically in the formal reports. What an opportunity is. An opportunity is an observation where practice meets the compliance, but could be improved upon. So there's no recommendations, there's no violation of the audit protocol, but based upon an assessor's personal experience and history and expertise, they may know of a way that could improve the management system to make that more efficient. Typically, they're not included in assessment or compliance assessment reports because compliance assessment reports typically have to be very focused to that area, but they are reported on risk-based assessments. Recommendations, our last definition. A recommendation is merely a set of instructions on how a facility should or could address identified findings. Always one recommendation per finding or opportunity. You can have multiple recommendations on that, but there could be different ways of meeting that recommendation. It may or may not be part of the final reports, depends on a company policy. Some companies require that when they are part of internal audit groups or a corporate group or required by a legal entity, but typically they're not required for third-party assessments. And the reason that they're typically not required for third-party assessments is that the third-party assessor may not have access to business confidential material that the company does, or other business strategy that could be coming up, such as a turnaround or a switch out on a product line or campaign. Okay, let's talk about developing what findings are. First, it requires a description of the issue involved, just a very brief description of what was found. It should include the number of samples reviewed to support the finding, and that kind of gives indication whether this is a outlier or something more involved. So I reviewed 300 out of a possible 1,000, and I found these errors. It should always have the citation or regulation or standard pertaining to the finding. This goes to the fact base. And a finding should be flagged if it's a repeat. And what it means if it's a repeat finding from a prior audit is that there could be something more systemically wrong with the management system or leadership in the way they're executing their program. It should also identify if the facility has actions to rectify the finding in the time of the assessment. And what's important about that is that indicates that there could be a problem that's beyond the facility's ability to close it. This could be a reliance upon a material, a special alloy, a turnaround, capital or resourcing that's beyond the facility's control. Now, both findings from multiple assessors on the same topic should always be combined. You don't want to create more findings and recommendations than necessary. You always want to bring it in as succinctly as possible. Developing observations. A brief description of the issues involved, very similar to a finding. Field observations should have a picture showing the issue. There's a saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that really helps the facility people find something that they might have walked past multiple times and not observed it. It should have the location, equipment tag if possible, and vessel number, and it should be raised in the daily meetings before the closeout. This is to make sure that there's no surprises at the end of the audit. It should have a citation of the regulation or standard pertaining to the observation that was seen and confirm that the observed issues have been corrected before leaving. Otherwise, it could become a finding. If it's not easily resolved, that would be indicative of a systematic problem in management or leadership. Developing recommendations. Where a corporate policy or assessment scope requires that recommendation or issues, those recommendations must describe the issue to be resolved, very similar to developing the recommendation, provide a reference to the standard, the regulation or policy involved, provide one or more ways to address the issue, and the issues and the resolutions must be actionable and specific. I like to follow the SMART goals process, which stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And it should allow for the issue to be resolved in other ways if necessary. You don't want to eliminate the innovation that a site can have to close things out that you may not be aware of. And this could go anything from where they want to schedule to a turnaround, or if they're doing an engineering analysis, they may come up with an alternate technology or process that would be a better way of closing out the recommendation. And recommendations should always be written that they can be completed without referencing the assessment report. This means it should be able to be standalone, meaning if the recommendation is based upon the finding, which is factual base, and the finding was developed and written well, the recommendation should follow that. Some additional comments. The goal of assessment is to help facilities improve. And what that means is if you follow the process, you won't have a whole bunch of overwhelming recommendations that confuses the site and doesn't give them directions of how they can improve. That's not very helpful. The vague findings or recommendations are also not actionable and really don't follow the SMART goals and achievable, and it makes it difficult for a site to do it. And maybe years after the audit, it can be difficult for someone looking at that to understand what it is. And as someone is trying to understand a vague recommendation, they may not be able to solve the finding that was identified. And once again, repeated findings on the same issue create an excessive work to track and complete. So you could have multiple efforts trying to close out the same singular systematic management issue by multiple entities at the facility or corporate. So reporting and follow-up. So the draft report should be issued to facilities point of contact. That should be a single point of contact. And that could either be the site coordinator, the corporate manager, or legal counsel. Those are typically the people are identified early on before the assessment begins. And that's very important because if it's issued to multiple people could be taking actions to work on that. And the draft report is not the final report, which is actionable. And so that usually could include people taking false starts or work that may have to be redone because a recommendation may change from the draft to the final report. The final report should be issued after the facility has time to review and comment on it, just to make sure that all evidence is presented and anything that was missed by the assessor or there wasn't time to close out can be found and resolved before the final is issued. That goes back to the importance of issuing it to a single point of contact, just to make sure that people get the final report and it's distributed and the times and conditions of the company issuing the assessment. So what goes into the final report? It should document the scope of the assessment, the team involved, and the dates of the assessment. This is a time mark of when this assessment is and when it was covered and who was part of it. Now, if it's a regulatory or accreditation audit, it has to have a certification typically, and that's in the beginning of the report. And that could be an attestation to an ISO, responsible care, and even sometimes a government entity or agency. The report should include a summation of all findings with each finding, including a brief description of the issue involved, a number of samples reviewed to support the findings to indicate how large of an issue this is, and also to make sure that people understand it is factually based, a citation of the regulation or standing to the findings to make sure that people understand where it is in the protocol and what the true gap is. And if applicable, and in the report, a recommendation for corrective actions. And then also it should flag whether this is a repeat items from prior audits, which goes back to, is there a larger issue that could be systemic in the management system, the way the management system comes together, leadership, or resourcing that could be beyond the facility's capabilities. So things that are optional in report content that sometimes is more typical, where the scope of the assessment requires, it could include an overall score or ranking of the facility by each element assessed under the protocol, and maybe a total ranking for this site. And this can be either based upon a risk ranking, a prioritization of the findings based upon the hazards that they present, and it can be based upon an assessor's qualitative evaluation based upon their experience. But typically it's based on a corporate risk matrix that would identify any consequence that could come from that finding, from the gap in the finding, and the frequency, the typical definition of risk. The full protocol used for the assessment should usually be included in an appendix, but not always. And then, of course, if there's any benchmarking against other facilities within the company or the industry, I know the American Petroleum Institute does something similar to that, and there may be other ones that you can benchmark against to see where you rely upon other industries or other companies in your industry. So some additional things on reporting. In some cases, the assessments are presented to corporate representatives, which could include the company board of directors or senior executives. When a report is issued to them, The auditor needs to be aware that each presentation should address individual finding and recommendations that may also include an estimate of time or manpower required to correct. Typically, boards and executives are interested in what type of additional support and resources they need to provide to the facility to make sure they're in compliance. It also should include an overall level of performance at the facility. Is this facility performing as it should be performing, or is more attention by senior executive leadership required? And of course, the areas of highest risk, which is what most executives and board of directors are interested in an assessment, is where their risk lies and where they need to focus their time and resources. So follow-up actions. A facility or corporate group is typically responsible for implementing, tracking, and resourcing corrective actions. If the assessment is at the facility level, typically the facility should be able to handle that, track it, and close them. However, corporate groups may be involved if the assessment was asked by a corporate entity, or the facility is unable to close out the recommendations based upon a resource constraint or a capital constraint. And then they may pass it up to corporate for additional support, or they may not have the subject matter expertise or engineering to complete it. Assessors are not usually directly involved in action follow-ups, mainly because there should be an independence between that. And typically that's not the assessor's area of expertise. And they don't always have that inside knowledge of the facility or business goals that people inside the facility and corporate entity do. Some facilities may also request the support from SMEs attending to the assessment to help evaluate those proposals and make sure that the effectiveness of these actions are taken to address those. That's typically an engineering or a technology or sometimes a reliability specialist to make sure that they're applying the best recognized and generally accepted good engineering practice, and it's in conjunction with the business plans of that facility. So with that, we'll start taking any questions, but before we do that, I'll turn it over to Wayne.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Dwayne. Before we get to questions, I want to allow Amr Hassan to say a few words. He always gives a recap at the end of our sessions. So I think he's got a few minutes to go ahead and
Yes.
say a few words. Amr?
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Jeff and Eric, for this wonderful presentation. I just need to recap in 3 points. The first point, why we recommend that the gap assessment to be by independent team, because of mainly two things. The first one is to avoid any kind of pressure or potential bias for the assessor. To ensure that he reflects the actual gaps. The second one also, it's we need to have the independent, to have somebody who call the eye, because if you are within the facility, sometimes there is some gaps and you don't recognize it well. So when you have somebody from outside, you have a cold eye, so he can easily identify the area for improvement. The second point, which is very important, the competence requirement. The competence requirement drives the kind and level of the recommendation and observation. So it's very important to ensure that the lead assessor has the competence requirement to provide the actual notes or actual observation. The second point, I want to address the site walk down or site verification. As you can see from Eric, from Jeff's presentation, the site walk down, it supports the audit. Because I have seen before that some teams put too much effort on the side walk down to be dominating the audit, so the site verification or the physical barrier verification is dominating the audit itself. So it should be supporting the audit, not dominating the audit. The third point I want to touch also is the site buy-in, because the any gap assessment has two objectives. The first objective to reflect the area for improvement and observation of the site. The second one to be able to implement the recommendation. So if the site team did not buy in and engage with the audit team, I have seen before a very excellent audit report, but never touch it. Just they take the report and leave it for the next assessment. So the buy-in is very important to be engaged with the site and to share with them why this finding is first is really genuine and true, and why it is very important to be implemented. So this is the 3 points I want to touch, and thank you all. Wayne.
Thanks, Amr. Appreciate your insights as always. I see a lot of questions about the deck and the recording, so I just want to reiterate, you will get the deck. In a few hours after the presentation's over, you're going to get the deck. In 2 weeks, you'll get all the questions and answers. And in 1 week, you will get a copy of the recording. Okay, so you will get everything you have seen and heard today. And now we'll go over to Naomi for some Q&A.
Thank you, Wayne. I'll go ahead and ask some of the questions that did come up during the presentation. And just as a reminder to our attendees, if you haven't already done so, be sure to type your questions into the Q&A box in your control panel. So first question for our presenters. How closely should you follow the protocol questions when conducting an assessment?
Oh, I'll cover this. Typically, that's something that is partly based on the experience of the person doing the assessment. So as I mentioned during the presentation, at a minimum, your auditor is expected to cover everything in the protocol. If you have a junior person who has not done a lot of these assessments in the past, they probably should stick very closely to the protocol. They may even want to go question by question and read out the protocol as it stands. A senior person who's very familiar with what's in the protocol, familiar with the regulation or the standard that's being assessed, is probably free to move off of actually just following point by point what's on the protocol, because they know what's expected to be covered. They can take a more conversational tone. It can provide a more relaxed atmosphere in actually addressing things, but they'll still ensure that everything is covered appropriately, because they have the experience to know what are the issues I need to be looking for, what are the issues that are going to come up, and what is the minimum performance that needs to be addressed within that protocol. So the protocol is really there as a tool. It's there to support junior auditors and to ensure that things are covered. But if you have the experience and you have the knowledge in the area, then you probably don't want to just slavishly follow it, because it's going to create a more confrontational type of interview than you would get by just having a conversational type interview without strictly following that list of questions.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Next question. When would you expect to issue findings versus providing recommendations to a company?
I'll talk to that again. Findings are always expected and will always be published. In terms of recommendations, that's usually only done when you're dealing with internal audit groups. So you have a corporate audit group who's dealing with their own site. They're not reporting to that site, but it is their own company. So they will often provide recommendations following corporate strategy or corporate technical requirements. Usually external auditors will only provide recommendations if it's specifically requested by the company who wants the assessment done, because they don't have the background on how the company is set up, how it's managed, what type of resources they have available.
Yeah, I'll build upon that a little bit too.
Okay.
If recommendations are not included with the final assessment report, there's typically a standard that the company has indicating how long they have to develop recommendations to close out the findings that are in the final assessment report. and that usually starts a time. And typically that will have enough time for the facility or the company to develop a true recommendation that will close it and allow them to do some type of engineering analysis or capital allocations or scheduling with turnarounds. But that has to be within the time frame designated by the company. I've typically seen anywhere from 30 to 90 days. And it's also based upon the prioritization of the finding to the recommendation. If it's a high finding indicating an area of risk, there will be a greater urgency and also a little bit more rigor in developing the closing of that.
Gotcha. So another question is, what key takeaways do you think management is looking for when an assessment is conducted?
I'll take that one. I'm used to reviewing assessments from my previous roles in executive leadership. And really what we look for in those is, how is that facility performing? We're not so much interested in outliers or individuals, but we're really looking at the management system and the execution of the leadership. Are they addressing the high levels of risk? Do I have assurance and confidence as a member of the executive team and also senior leadership and my responsibility to the company that this facility is operating as they should be, and they can deliver our product reliably and without regulatory issues, and they don't present a risk to our key stakeholders? And really, a well-written audit assessment and recommendations following that report should indicate that. And we talked a little bit about what happens if it goes up to an executive or senior leadership team, what needs to be included. But really what is looked for is that site performing the way it should be, the way it's expected? And does the board have assurance that this facility will operate as intended and without issue?
Excellent. Do you or either of you have any personal advice or techniques that you use when auditing?
Yeah, I think we all do. And since I've already got the microphone, I'll just keep rolling with this and then let Jeff and Dwayne pitch in. But
Okay.
I really like doing management of change. And the reason I like management of change is that, to me, it's a really good snapshot of the overall facilities management system, because management of change touches a lot of the elements of a process safety program. So if you're reviewing a management of change, it should touch upon process safety information. It should touch upon standard operating procedures. It should touch upon PHA, or hazard identification risk assessment. It will touch upon training as well. And when you look at management system of a process safety program, they all have to be working in conjunction. And so when you start with management of change, you'll typically follow or find other areas that may you need to look a little bit deeper into. And you can also get, like I said, just a wonderful snapshot of how that facility is operating in leadership and management systems, staffing, resources, and ability to close out action items, and how their system is truly connected. The most important thing about process safety to me is the connectivity of those elements, and they have to all be functioning for the management system to operate efficiently.
Gotcha.
Jeff?
So I would say one of the key things in terms of auditing that I look for is an auditor's performance is largely based on attitude, personality, and how they interact with other people. Someone who goes in with the attitude that they're going to enforce regulations, be the cop, sort of push the site, is going to have an unsuccessful audit. You need to view the site as somebody you're trying to help, somebody you're trying to communicate with, somebody you're trying to be open to. Personal interaction on the audit is a key performance indicator and really will help decide whether an audit is successful or not.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate y'all's insights on that. It looks like we've run out of time for the webinar, so I'm going to ask one last question before we conclude and get closing remarks. But how are the recognized and generally accepted good engineering principles or good practices applied in assessment findings?
I think Jeff and I are both waiting on that. Let Jeff go.
So typically, if you have a strict compliance audit, they're not. They might be included in observations or in opportunities that are not in the actual formal report, but communicated to site anyways, because you can give the site recommendations on things they can improve. But when you're talking about risk-based performance protocols, then you're going to look at things that are not necessarily required performance, but they are standards that should be complied to ensure good performance at the site. So when you're looking at codes and standards that are not necessarily regulatory, not necessarily compliance, they'll be findings or recommendations in a risk-based assessment, but they may end up only being observations or positive behavior observations in a compliance audit. Although one thing you have to look out for is a lot of regulations will refer to other outside codes and standards inside the regulation. So if I go to specific jurisdictions, compliance to an API standard may actually be a regulatory requirement, depending on what the regulation refers to as this is a code you have to comply to, even though it's not a published regulatory document.
Yeah, and I'll build upon that a little bit too, is that the US OSHA PSM requirement references RAGAGAP, which is recognized and generally accepted good engineering practice, in two places of the elements, and that is in process safety information, typically the design standards that were used to build the facility, and then in asset integrity management, the reference standards of how to maintain it. And what's important to note that where it will come into a compliance is if you list that your site was built to a specific standard, you've identified that as RAGAGAP, and therefore that site must be built to those standards unless it's noted by exceptions. And that also will apply into asset integrity management as well. So you have to be careful with that. There's a little subtlety that Jeff hinted at. That really it's going to be important when you have your assessment come in that the assessor understands that and knows the limitations of the boundary of where that RAGAGAP is truly applicable and where it's actually just recommended in an observation or an opportunity to improve.
Excellent. Well, Wayne, Jeff, Eric, Dwayne, and Amber, it looks like we've only covered a few of the questions that were asked. And I want to thank you, Dwayne, for answering the questions that some of the questions live in the chat. And to our attendees, if you have additional questions, go ahead and type those into the Q&A box. And as Wayne said, our presenters will answer those and we'll get those sent out, post their responses via our email or newsletter, LinkedIn, and to our BakerRisk website, which will also have a link to the recorded webinar and slides for the presentation. So Wayne, I'll turn it back over to you for final remarks and to close us out.
Great. Thank you, Naomi. Thank you, everyone. Do you have any additional comments off of those last couple of questions? Anything else you want to add?
No, I'm fine. Thank you.
Nothing?
No, I just maybe I touched for the last thing that the Jeff mentioned that the lead assessor should be going to force the recommendation. This is very important. I mentioned that if the site start feel this impression that have been pushed to do something, it will be pushed back and the audit recommendation will not be closed. So it's very important to engage with the site team, feel that we are team together and our objective to apply the reasonable recommendation and gaps. That's it.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for reiterating that. I think that's an important point. Great. Jeff, Eric, Dwayne, thank you for your expertise, for sharing that. I know it's been a very early morning for all of you. As always, we appreciate your insight and your wisdom. And then I want to thank the team behind the scenes. These webinars do not just happen on their own. It takes a lot of input, takes months of advanced planning and practice and getting it together and coordinating it. So Naomi Alarcon, who you hear every single webinar, is really the big one behind it and runs this whole show. So thank you, Naomi. And then we have our Marcom team with Tilly Nutter. Thank you, Tilly. And our BD coordinator with Annie Ballas. Thank you, Annie. early mornings for both of them as well. And then, of course, we had our administrative team, Joanna Sabatkar, who's been involved in all of these that we've presented thus far too. So thank you. It's a big team behind the scenes. And thank you to them. Thank you for everybody attending and for the questions. Please do let us know what you're interested in for the 7th webinar. That'll be in December. And we will take, we'll look at all the topics that you suggest, and we'll start putting something together. Our planning typically will start 3 months in advance on that. So the sooner you can let us know, the better. And thank you again for your attendance. Continue to send us questions. We appreciate your interest. We look forward to seeing you again in Cairo very, very soon, or anywhere in Egypt, wherever you may be. So thank you all. Thank you again. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.